it's the modern world. We wanted it to reflect as realistically as we could the people that exist in that world, and that's everybody.
So, this is always a little bit of a challenging topic, but looking back on the game, I'm curious what you think, in retrospect, you would have liked to have done differently, or something that wasn't in the game that you would have liked to have added, or thoughts you have about the feedback that the game got after it came out. I know some people like to go and see what all the feedback is. Some people like to avoid it, but who has an idea to start for this one?
So we've sort of talked about whatever I have to say about feedback. We've already talked about when we've talked about being on the Wizards of the Coast message boards, Charles and I being on the Wizards of the Coast message boards. But one thing that was on my mind when I was designing the game was I did not want D20 Modern to become role-playing your favorite gun. I wanted there needed to be guns in there, obviously, for modern action movie based games. We needed to have firearms. So something that I think I could have done better, leaving aside the fact that I'm just a better writer than I was 20 years ago, something that I could have done better is talked about the role playing aspect of why you wanted to carry a particular piece of equipment or a particular firearm. What does it say about your character? Like in Lethal Weapon, there's a scene between Riggs and Murtaugh where Riggs is talking about how old-fashioned Murtaugh's revolver is. And it's a running theme, as we all, everybody who's watched Lethal Weapon movies knows, right? I'm getting too old for this stuff, is a running theme throughout those movies. And so why you would make a particular choice when mathematically, statistically, two weapons are very similar. I wish I had been smart enough to put that in.
I ran and played a lot of D20 Modern, both during the development period and for years after. And I don't really have an awful lot of complaints about the game. I think we did a pretty good job of hitting the design goals we were after. And I'm pretty proud of the work in that. I can quibble with 20 years experience of where game design has gone. As Bill has pointed out, that the D20 system was pretty complex. It put a lot of work on the GM to do a lot of mechanical preparation and stuff like that, which is not where I think games want to be these days. But that, it is what it is for its time. If I were to complain about anything at all, I would say that the class structure that we built served our design goals really, really well. But they did leave it feeling a little generic in play sometimes. I don't know what the solution is to that. Maybe even just a touch more flavor to those character classes, or maybe bringing the advanced classes down to where you could pick them up at third level or second level or something. But that's a minor quibble, right? Like I think that overall the game played great and served a lot of genres really, really well.
Yeah, for me, the idea of a toolbox is probably not the way I would go today, right? I think that it's probably more complex than the modern audience, the grander part of the modern audience would want to deal with. I think smaller chunks based on a particular setting and genre with a little more flavor is probably the way to go. But I'm still proud of what we did, and it developed my sense of game design, or continued my development of game design to where I am today. But if I had it to do again, I might make the toolbox smaller and the genre larger, because that's really what sells a game, I think, now.
And I do want to point out, right, 20 years ago, publishing material on the internet was in its infancy. Yeah. And so the idea that we could have taken material out of the book, made a more focused book, and then put expanded material on our website, or even sell that material on our website, that was a totally new idea, right? I mean, I was thrilled to get to write the Grim Frequencies adventures, those that did get published on the Wizards website. because that was a whole new way of us getting material into the hands of players.
Yeah, this was before RPG Now and what became Drive-Thru. Yeah.
It also cuts the other direction. Now we have more access to material from a wide variety of sources than we did back in the day, where basically you had the ballistic guide available for, basically for all the various handguns. We can find that information a lot easier and from more variety of places. And actually, Rich, I'm actually going to go the other direction with you. One thing we talked about early on when we do the design is to get onto a shooting range and shoot some guns. Basically, get a feel and flavor for them. I'd shot in when I was in Scouts, and Rich and Charles both have service in the National Guard. But the idea of I had never handled an automatic weapon, so most of the stuff I've done has been pistols and rifles, and so that type of thing of adding to the depth of our experiences probably would have been a better thing as well. Not going so far as to play your favorite gun, but also being aware of the mechanics, what has to be done to utilize them.
I have shot in many an arcade and in computer games.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like Jeff was arguing for a trip to Vegas.
Should be an integral part of any RPG design.
Road trip.
Yep, Brazilian steakhouses and firearms ranges were there. And how else are you going to learn how to write the gambling rules?
Right.
Nothing like firsthand experience. Yeah, I think, the nature of research for any kind of writing has changed dramatically, with the sort of Web 2.0 time. You can go on and watch YouTube videos of almost anything. It's pretty amazing.
This is slightly off topic, but when I wrote my original Star Wars guides, it was before the internet. So I had to do all my research by paper.
Right.
And, today there's Wikipedia, which would have made it a whole lot easier, but they basically used my book to make that. So,
Full circle. All right. So to follow up that, you mentioned going down to Vegas and doing a little gambling. I think one of the challenges with a modern game, especially when you're using film as an inspiration, there's a lot of subjects that get tackled in action cinema. I mean, violence for a start, but you also end up with questions of, abuse of other people. You've got drugs. You've got gambling. How did you approach these topics, things that could be controversial, while trying to give game masters the tools to approach, genre stories?
So we didn't go too deep into some of those areas because, frankly, I don't find that to be where the fun is. But if your game wants to do that and your players agree, that's between you and them. But we really don't deal with drug addiction in our game, and conversely, we don't have drugs that give you superpowers or anything like that. At least not in the modern setting. You have to be really careful with, you don't want to say that somebody who's blind is a lesser person than you are, right? So again, we stayed away from those things, right? That's between the game master and the player, at least in my estimation. We're talking 20 years ago, before a lot of this was becoming socially acceptable. We still tried to avoid saying that the vet who lost his leg is somehow diminished. That's not true, and we don't want it to make game stats that say that.
And I think anytime you approach those things, you probably want to be thinking about what you're trying to accomplish with your game, right? So I think that a lot of players might be like, gambling rules, how much money can I win? But then you go and you look at the genre, right? Like gambling's a big factor in James Bond movies, but it's never about how much money he walks out with. It's about how he comes up to the table and how debonair he looks, and then the interaction he has across the table with the person that is actually the supervillain or the supervillain's henchman, and sort of the table talk and all of that. And the winning or losing is just an adjunct to that interaction that's moving the narrative forward, right? So I think that you could apply that to any of these topics, drug use or abusive relationships or anything else, is be like, what is the role of it in the story? What do you want to address? You're probably the story and the game is probably not served by creating a system of simulation for whatever the issue is at hand. It's probably served by treating it thematically or seeing how it affects the narrative that you're building.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a real challenge to, offer this kind of support people are interested in order to create a world that feels alive and feels like the real world, but not. It was less of a concern maybe at the time of D20 Modern, but obviously still on your mind, communicating to people your intention when it comes to diversity and modeling. Were you taking a lesson from things that happened in the past, or were you looking forward to ideas that you had about the future when you were considering these questions?
We started with the art direction for third edition D&D itself, right? We began to add more people of color, more women. We thought a lot about the look and feel of the characters and the world itself. Todd Lockwood and Sam. Somebody help me, Sam
Wood.
Sam Wood. Thank you.
Yes, Wood. Yeah.
Were the driving artists for that, concept artists for that. And when we got to D20 Modern, it's the modern world. We wanted it to reflect as realistically as we could the people that exist in that world, and that's everybody. We probably could go further, and the games today are, and that's great. But back then, we were coming from a point where everybody was a white guy, and moving to well, we want women characters too. That was the first big leap forward. Women play the game too, and then people of color, and it just built from there as we became more sensitive to the fact that we were living in a bubble of our own creation.
I agree with Bill completely, because at that time I had been gaming for 20 or 30 years, and I had always had women play in my games. Always. The idea that somehow women were lesser just did not match with my experience. And I had some actual feedback from women I played with about how art overly sexualized them. And so going into already seeing that third edition was moving away from that, I was anxious that we would move the needle further as we went along. So I remember, I don't want to get into this in detail, but I do remember that there was some pushback. Would we alienate our core audience if we just diversified a great deal, went from 0 to 100 miles an hour, basically? If we did that, would we alienate the core audience? What was sort of a middle step that we could take that would definitely move us into something that looked more, as Bill has said a couple of times, looked more like the world that we see around us every day?
We had to actually make the artists draw people that weren't white, because that's just the way they did it. So we had to put in our art orders specifically what the characters should look like, at least until they started to get used to that. And the other part of it is that earlier editions of D&D, women couldn't be as strong as men, right? We got rid of that too, right? And suddenly everybody was on equal footing.
Yeah, that died.
Yeah.
That died early.
Yeah.
So but I was just thinking about that, how much we moved from where we had in first edition D&D, and basically third edition, and now moving forward into fifth, we basically are seeing progress, and we did move the needle a little.
It all seems so obvious from where we are now. Like, of course we would do these things, right? There's no question about it. And I don't even think there were questions in our mind back then. But the context was one of it was a real cusp, right? Like, you go back to the 80s and the 90s, and D&D was seen as something that white male kids did in their parents' basement, right? It had this definite feeling, and that there was a basis for that, right? And it's not coincidental that when you look at a screen of 4 different game designers here whose roots go back to the 90s and 80s, and we're all white guys, because that's who was doing it back then, right? And nowadays, of course, that's not where it was. But this period of the early 2000s was right where where I think things were beginning to change. When I was the brand manager after D20 Modern, one of the informal things I would do every time I go to one of our events, I'd walk the halls of our game stuff, and I would count it, and I'd come back and I'd be like, yeah, 18% of the gamers at the table were not white guys, right? Were women or people of colors. And that's up 1.5% from the last event I went to. And I was like, this is great for us. But like, that was the turning point in that era. And I don't want to call us out as being like mega progressive or anything like that. I'm not trying to toot our own horns too much, but I think I can speak for everybody here that we just kind of felt like that's where we wanted to be, right? We wanted gaming to look like the real world and not be white guys in basements, and so that was just an obvious thing to do.
Even in the art direction, I didn't want chainmail bikinis, right? People had to wear armor that actually protected them. It should still look cool and potentially sexy, but it should still cover all the right parts, right? Because it has to be functional.
And I do want to say that although I do remember times like Bill was talking about where we had to say, no, you don't have to do this as a white person. You can do this as some other look at other cultures and ethnicities from around the globe and get inspiration, visual inspiration. But I do remember also that after we gave that kind of feedback to the artists, a lot of the artists got really excited. Once they knew it was okay, they were 100% on board. They wanted to do it. They wanted to get to diversify this. And I remember this also being a period where Wizards hiring started to change. Like Wizards was really looking just in general across all the disciplines within the company, saying, why are there so, we have a lot of women who work here in general, but why are we all white? Why can't we move? Why can't we have more diversity? Who are we not reaching out to? Right. And it was a learning period. There are more resources now for how to hire a diverse workforce than there were in 2002.
Yeah, I was going to say I think that there's always inertia in every community and every culture and every system, right? What its origins are, and that inertia carries forward, and it takes conscious effort. It takes some deliberate intention to change, to move that inertia, to not just keep doing what you were doing before, but to try and leverage something different that you think is missing. Same as game design, but it's also true in game culture. And I think it was effective. I think that period of time really was a turning point. And, we went from, I would go to conventions and pretty much nothing but guys and white guys. And nowadays you go in, it's, still the majority, but it's a lot more diverse than it was. It really is a lot different. And I think the efforts of that time period 20 years ago were kind of a fulcrum point where we really started to be deliberate about changing that. And I think it had a real effect. So.
I think we're in the middle of that next shift. I think the pandemic has been wonderful for gaming. I hate to say it that way, but gaming has exploded because of the pandemic as a way to still connect with people in some meaningful way.